The first knock came sharp through the howl of the wind. 3 quick raps that didn't belong to a branch or a loose board. I had been at my table oil lamp turned low, working a whetstone along the edge of my skinning knife. Outside, snow pushed high against the windows, the kind of cold that seeped into bone if you stood still too long. I rose slow boots, heavy on the plank floor, and eased the latch. When the door swung open, she was there barefoot in the drift, her dress torn and stiff with ice hair, tangled cheeks flushed raw from the wind. A child clung to her hip under a ragged blanket, another stood at her side with a slingshot in hand. She met my eyes and whispered steady as she could, "I will warm your bed. My children need a father. Just don't send us back out there." Before I tell you what happened next, let me know where you're listening from in the comments and tap like and subscribe if you've ever stood at a crossroads where one choice could change everything. My name's Eli Harland. I was born in the hill country east of Helena, back when the land was more pine than people. My father broke horses for the army posts my mother kept, the kind of home that ran on hard work, Sunday prayer, and whatever we could pull from the soil. We learned early that a man's word was worth more than gold, and that neighbors were your first line of defense when the weather turned mean. I carried those lessons into my own life, even after I struck out on my own, with a pack, a rifle, and a stretch of trap lines along the high ridges. For years it was enough the work was honest, the days my own. Then came the fire. I'd been out past the creek checking snares when the stovepipe caught. By the time I reached the cabin, smoke was thick enough to choke a mule. I pulled my wife Clara clear, but the flames took the rest. Our boy was still inside. Folks from the nearest homestead came to help bury them, then left me to the quiet. I didn't leave these mountains after that. Didn't see the point. I traded in pelts when I had to keep to myself, and spoke to no one longer than it took to settle a deal. Life in the high country teaches you thrift whether you want it or not. My cabin held only what I needed, a tight roof, a steady fire, and a store of flour and beans for winter. Town life was different. Silver men and speculators throwing coin at painted hotels and polished boots while the rest scraped by. I'd passed through enough to know that kind of noise didn't belong to me. The land was quieter, harsher, but it didn't lie. That winter of '82 had been the worst in years. Snow came early, stayed heavy, and seemed to fall harder every time I thought it might ease. I'd gone more than a week without another voice in the room, content to ride it out the way I always had. Until that knock. Until the door swung open to a woman with the storm at her back and something desperate in her eyes. I hadn't decided yet if I'd let her in, when the little one whimpered and the boy tightened his grip on that slingshot. The wind cut sharper when I stepped aside and let them through. Snow slid from her shoulders as she crossed the threshold, her bare feet leaving dark, wet marks on the planks. The boy followed close, his hand tight on that slingshot, eyes fixed on me like he meant to stand between me and his kin if it came to it. I closed the door behind them, and the cabin went quiet, but for the fire's low hiss. I told her to get the little one near the hearth and set her down on the folded fur there. She knelt without a word, easing the child down, smoothing the tangled hair back from her pale forehead. I went to the shelf and took down 3 bowls. The stew in the kettle was rabbit and barley still hot enough to steam in the lamplight. I ladled it out, set a bowl in front of each of them, and handed the last to her. The boy was careful with his spoon, sharing each bite with his sister, where she lay half asleep. She didn't touch her own until they were fed, then lifted it slow, her hands trembling a little from cold and hunger. She looked at me once over the rim, brown eyes steady, and didn't look away. When they'd finished, I rolled out another fur in the corner. "You'll sleep there," I said. She glanced at the bedding, then back at me, her face unreadable. "You can stay tonight. That's all I'm saying." She nodded once. "That's enough. She lay down with the little girl in her arms, the boy curled at her back. Her dress had slipped at the shoulder, showing the edge of a deep bruise along her collarbone. She didn't cover it, and I didn't ask. I sat back in my chair and kept the fire going through the night. The sound of their breathing filled the room strange, after years of nothing but the creak of timbers and the wind under the eaves. I didn't sleep, just listened until the first pale light showed through the frost on the window. By morning, the fire had burned low. She was up before either child stirred, kneeling near the hearth with her arms wrapped around herself. The shirt she wore was the same thin, torn dress from the night before. I told her there was water in the basin if she wanted it. She rose slow, moving like every step had to be measured, and began wiping the girl's face with a stiff washcloth. The boy stayed close still, watching me with that steady, guarded look. I mixed flour and water, set the batter into a hot skillet, and fried it until the cabin filled with the smell of bread. I gave each of them a piece. She split hers with the children until I told her to eat too. "It's more than we've had in a while," she said softly. Before I left to check my traps east of the creek, she asked if I wanted help around the place. I told her to keep the fire up and the children warm. When I came back at sundown, the cabin floor was swept. The blankets folded, the basin scrubbed. A pot simmered on the hearth with what was left of the broth. The children were by the fire, the girl stacking flat stones, the boy carving a stick with a dull spoon. She stood when I entered. "I didn't touch your things," she said. "Just kept the stove going. Water's clean." I told her keeping them warm was enough. She served the broth without fuss. Cal glanced at me once before lowering his eyes to the bowl. Later, after they'd settled, I handed her a clean shirt from my shelf. "It'll be warmer than what you've got," I said. She took it without speaking, holding it to her chest. On the third morning, she was already at the fire, sleeves rolled, hair tied back with a strip of flannel. My shirt hung loose on her frame, open at the throat, where she hadn't bothered with the top buttons. She'd found the baking tin behind the kettle, wiped it clean, and started bread again. I knelt beside the fire to check the heat close enough to catch the faint scent of soap and ash. I asked how she'd come so far from Miles City. She told me she'd walked, taken a wagon for a day, then jumped when a man tried to pull her off it. She'd skirted West Hollow, knowing the wrong eyes there could mean trouble for a woman alone with children. They'd followed a creek until the prince vanished, then spotted my chimney smoke and took a chance. "Could have gone different," I said. "I know," she answered, looking straight at me. But it didn't. That afternoon, I worked outside, clearing snow from the shed and stacking wood. When I stepped back inside, the smell of fresh bread met me. She was pulling the tin from the hearth sleeves, pushed up, hair damp from the heat. She cut slices for the children and herself. After we ate, I gave her another shirt, flannel-lined. She looked down at it, then up at me. "You keep giving me things," she said. I told her she kept staying. That night, she spoke low from her place by the hearth. "I'm not asking for anything. I just want to be safe for them. And for myself." I told her she was. She held my eyes a long moment before lying down beside the children. I stayed in my chair close enough to hear them breathing, and the quiet between us felt shared. By the next day, the snow had eased, though the air still bit hard. The fire hadn't gone out since they'd arrived. She made sure of it. She handed me a bowl of porridge without a word, our hands brushing when I took it. I told her about the coop's hinge sticking and where the feed was kept, watched her listen close without interrupting. When I returned from the trap line that afternoon, she was outside sweeping the stone step, the wind lifting her hair from her shoulders. She moved aside so I could pass her arm, brushing mine in the narrow space. Inside, I showed Cal how to split kindling. He watched each stroke, tried it himself, and got it right on the third swing. I nodded, and he seemed to take that as enough. That evening, she sat by the fire brushing out her hair. I sharpened a carving knife, the scrape of steel filling the space between us. She asked if I ever planned to go back to town. I told her I had no reason, family was buried, friends gone. She said hers had stopped calling her kin the day her husband died. You stayed here all these years because of guilt, she said. I didn't answer, but I didn't deny it. You don't owe ghosts a lifetime, she told me. You're saving us now. I looked at her, then at the set of her shoulders, the calm in her eyes. You've been here 4 nights, I said. I know, she replied, and you're planning to stay, if you'll let us. I went to the shelf, pulled down a blanket, and draped it over her shoulders, my hand brushing her neck. She froze for a breath, then exhaled. Her fingers touched my wrist. I'm not asking for your bed, she said. I just don't want to go. I didn't think you were, I answered. I cupped her cheek, leaned down, and let our foreheads touch before we kissed. Slow, steady, the kind that had been waiting in the room for days. When we parted, she rested her head against my chest. We stayed that way until the fire burned low. Outside, the wind moved through the trees, but inside, for the first time in years, I wasn't alone. The snow began to soften in the days after that night by the fire, though the drifts still stood high in the shadows of the pines. Inside the cabin, the air carried the scent of wood smoke and fresh bread more often now. Miriam had taken to wearing the flannel shirt I'd given her, cinched at the waist with a cord, her patched dress hanging to dry over the back of a chair. She moved easily through the space, tending the fire-boiling water, mending seams, all without asking where things belonged. The children seemed lighter too. Cal spent more time near the door or window watching the yard instead of guarding his sister. Annie hummed to herself, stacking sticks or following her mother from one task to the next. One morning, while I sat mending a strap at the table, Miriam set a tin cup of hot coffee beside me. She didn't speak, just brushed her fingers lightly over my shoulder before turning away. I watched her cross the room, the lamplight catching in her hair where it had come loose from its tie. The small things had begun to matter, how she knew to keep my tools in reach, how the stew pot was always set back on the right side of the hearth, where the heat ran even. That evening, after the children had eaten and settled under the firs, I worked a scrap of pine into the shape of a horse for Annie. Miriam stood at the wash basin, brushing out her hair in long, unhurried strokes. In the darkened window, I saw her glance toward me. She turned, walked across the room, and stopped within arm's reach. I think I'm ready to stop sleeping on the floor, she said. I rose, brushed the sawdust from my shirt, and asked if she was sure. I've known since the second night, she said. I stepped closer, my hand finding her waist. You're not here because I let you in, I told her. You stay because you belong. She answered without looking away. I stayed because you looked at me and didn't expect anything. The quiet between us held steady as I kissed her again, slower this time, with the ease of something long decided. We moved to the cot, lying under the heavy furs facing each other. Her fingers traced the edge of a scar on my chest. The bruises at her collarbone were fading now, her skin warm under my hand. Outside, the wind moved through the trees, but inside we matched our breathing and let the silence cover us. The next mornings fell into a rhythm. Miriam rose before me to stoke the fire, the sound of the poker tapping against the grate. Cal started joining me outside, hauling kindling or checking the line for fresh sign. Annie trailed after her mother with a tin cup, careful not to spill. Inside, Miriam had built a shelf from scrap wood near the hearth, sewn 2 flour sacks into curtains for the window, and boiled down elk fat into soap. The cabin no longer felt as it had before. It bore her touch in small, quiet ways. By the time March rolled in, the snow on the roof was melting in slow rivulets. Cal followed me on longer walks to the ridge, learning how to read tracks in the thawing crust. He asked short questions, now his voice no longer tight when the wind shifted through the trees. Back at the cabin, Annie laughed once, sharp and quick, when Miriam spilled a little flour on the table. It was a sound I hadn't heard in years, not from any child. One afternoon, Miriam stood in the doorway watching Cal and Annie chase each other around the small fenced yard. She turned to me and asked if I ever thought about leaving this place. I said I wasn't afraid of staying, but wasn't tied to the dirt either. "You made it feel like home again," I told her. She stepped closer, her arms folded under her chest, the flannel pulling snug across her frame. "If I said I want to stay here with you for good, I asked if she wasn't already." "I am," she said, "but not with a name. Not with something that tells Annie and Cal this is permanent." I set down the piece of leather in my hands, met her eyes, and told her I'd give her my name that day if she'd take it. She nodded. I'd take it today. That afternoon, we readied the mule and wagon. Miriam sat beside me under a blanket, her hand resting on my thigh, the children curled up in the back. Town was 2 hours away, the air warming just enough to smell the thaw in the earth. At the county office, the clerk asked our names, her widowhood, the children's ages. "You confirm this woman's under your protection?" he asked me. "She's my wife," I said. "Legally, she will be today." We signed the papers in a back room. No vows, no preacher, just ink and witness. When we stepped back into the street, she held the folded paper with my name on it, her shoulders eased like she'd set down a heavy load. On the ride home, Cal sat up front and asked if we could paint the door to the cabin. Why, I asked. "So folks know it's ours." I told him we would. The sun was dropping low when we reached the valley, the ridgeline catching the last light. Miriam changed into her mended dress and stood barefoot on the porch, looking out over the land. I came up behind her, my arms around her waist. She leaned back her head against my chest. "What now?" she asked. I looked toward the field where the soil waited for planting. "Now we grow things together," I said. Inside, Annie was humming Cal, working a piece of wood with his spoon, the fire burning low and steady. For the first time since before the winter, the cabin didn't feel like a shelter against the world. It felt like home. And out beyond the fence, the thawing earth promised the next season was coming, whether we were ready or not. By late April, the ridges around the valley were shedding their last snow. Meltwater pooled in the wagon ruts, and the smell of wet earth carried from the low fields to the cabin porch. Cal stood beside me as I turned the soil, his small hands gripping the seed sack Miriam had patched from old feed bags. I showed him how to space the beans, how deep to push the corn, and how to pace his steps so the rows came out straight. He worked quiet but steady, his face set in concentration. Inside, Miriam was scrubbing the window panes with vinegar and ash. The flannel shirt she'd claimed as her own was damp at the hem from the steam. She tied her hair up with a strip of worn cloth, the kind of knot that would hold all morning. There was more color in her cheeks now, and she moved without that careful pause she'd had when she first arrived. She had stopped just surviving the day. Now she filled it. A few days later, a rider came along the trail from the north. He was no older than 16, wrapped in a scarf too big for him, carrying a leather mail pouch. I met him at the fence line, and he handed over an envelope marked from Miles City before tipping his hat and heading on. The paper felt thin and official under my thumb. When I stepped back inside, Miriam was rinsing a pot at the basin. She saw my face and set the pot down. "What is it?" she asked. I broke the seal and read it through twice. It was from the county office. Someone from her late husband's family had filed a claim saying she'd run off with property that wasn't hers, even accused her of stealing livestock. Miriam's jaw tightened. "We didn't take anything," she said. "Just what belonged to me and the children. We didn't have a single animal." I told her I knew, but the county wanted a statement. Her eyes dropped to the table. "If I stay here, I put you at risk." "You're not leaving," I said. "What if they come?" she asked. "Then they'll find a wife and 2 children living under my roof," I told her. "Not a runaway." She sat down across from me, her hands clasped. "I don't want to lose this." I reached across the table and took her hand. "We'll go into town. Sign what needs signing. Make it legal. She looked up. Today, I nodded. As soon as you're ready. After lunch, we loaded the wagon. Miriam sat beside me under a wool blanket, her hand resting against my leg. Cal and Annie curled together in back on a pile of hides. The trail to town was slow, the thaw making the road soft. Hills rose on either side, the sky pale and high. When we reached the county office, the clerk took our names and asked the same questions from the letter. Miriam answered straight without hesitation, her voice clear. You confirm this woman's under your protection? The clerk asked. She's my wife, I said. Legally, she will be today. He led us into a back room where we signed the papers with one witness. There was no preacher, no ceremony, only the scratch of pen on paper. When we stepped back into the sunlight, she held the folded document in both hands. Something in her shoulders eased, like a weight had been set down. On the ride home, Cal asked if we could paint the cabin door blue. Why blue, I asked. So folks know it's ours, he said. I told him we would. Back at the cabin, Miriam changed into her mended dress and stepped barefoot onto the porch. She stood looking over the land, the same stretch that had nearly buried her in snow weeks ago. I came up behind her and wrapped my arms around her waist. What now? She asked. I looked toward the field where our new rose waited for rain. Now we grow things together, I said. Inside, Annie was humming at the hearth while Cal carved with his spoon. The fire burned low but steady, and the smell of fresh bread lingered in the air. The walls that had once held only my quiet now carried more than one kind of life. Out beyond the fence, the ridgeline stood dark against the evening sky, and I had the sense the next change was already on its way. By early June, the valley had turned green again. The trees along the fence line were heavy with new leaves, and wildflowers showed at the edges of the field. The wind that once cut sharp now moved soft, carrying the smell of grass and ash wood from the stove. Cal stood beside me at the far end of the rows, holding a tin pail of seed while I checked the young corn. He asked if it was good enough, and I told him it was growing, which was all that mattered. When we came back to the cabin, Miriam was standing barefoot on the porch. One hand rested just under her ribs, the fabric of her dress pulling with the breeze. She'd taken to wearing her hair down in the evenings, and the color in her cheeks was deeper these days. She watched us walk up, her eyes following until we set the pail by the door. That night, after the children had eaten and settled near the hearth, Miriam sat beside me at the table. Her hand slid to her belly before she spoke. I'm carrying, she said. I looked at her, waiting for more, but she only nodded. I've known for weeks. Just wanted to be sure. I reached across the table and covered her hand with mine. You don't need to ask for permission to stay or to grow here, I said. You're part of this land now. She lowered her gaze and smiled faintly. You say that like I've got roots. I told her she did. The weeks that followed moved quiet but sure. Cal painted the front door blue like he'd promised. Miriam began sewing small shirts from scraps of flannel and tucked them in a neat stack at the foot of the bed. Annie practiced carrying a tin cup without spilling her small steps steady on the plank floor. I mended the roof beams and built a second rocking chair for the porch. Late one afternoon, a wagon rolled up from town. Dust trailed behind it, and when it stopped at the fence, I recognized the county clerk who had filed our marriage papers. He stepped down, hat in hand, and told me someone from Miles City had been asking again about Miriam. I already told them she's your wife, and the children have your name, he said. That's all they're getting from me. I thanked him, and he left the parcel he'd brought before heading back down the road. Miriam had been standing in the doorway the whole time, one hand resting on the swell beneath her dress. She hadn't spoken, but she didn't need to. That evening, as the sun dropped low and turned the valley gold, Miriam walked barefoot into the garden rows. She touched the corn stalks now near chest height, letting the leaves slip between her fingers. This place doesn't feel like the end anymore, she said. It feels like the middle of something. I stepped up behind her, resting my hands on her hips. It is I said. It's the middle of our life. When she turned to face me, she smiled in a way I hadn't seen before, full and free. I leaned down and kissed her the garden and the wind around us. Inside, the children's laughter carried from the cabin. A loaf of bread cooled on the table, and the fire burned steady in the hearth. Miriam laid her hand on my chest. We're not just surviving anymore, are we? I told her no. We're living. The next morning, the air felt different, heavy with the promise of rain. I checked the sky as I stepped off the porch, the dark line of clouds pulling close from the west. Out on the trail, a rider was making his way toward the cabin. The rider reached the yard just as the clouds closed over the sun. His coat was slick with trail dust, the brim of his hat pulled low against the wind. I stepped off the porch to meet him at the fence. He handed over an envelope, the paper stiff from the ride, and said he'd been asked to deliver it straight to me. Without another word, he touched his hat and turned his horse back toward the ridge. Inside, I laid the envelope on the table. Miriam was by the hearth, turning a loaf from the oven onto a board. She looked from my face to the letter, drying her hands on her apron. From the county, she asked. I nodded and broke the seal. The handwriting was formal, and the words left no room for guessing. Someone from her late husband's family had lodged another complaint this time, claiming she'd withheld money owed to them. They were pushing for a hearing in town. Miriam stood still, her hands gripping the edge of the table. They'll try to take everything, she said quietly. They won't, I told her. Not while you're my wife. She shook her head. They'll say that's not enough. I folded the letter and slid it into my coat pocket. Then we'll stand in front of them and make it enough. 2 mornings later, we hitched the mule to the wagon. Miriam wore her mended dress with a shawl drawn close. Cal and Annie rode in back, bundled under a blanket. The road to town was soft with last night's rain, and the sky stayed low and gray. When we reached the main street, the sound of hammering came from the new freight office, and the smell of coffee drifted from the cafe near the square. At the courthouse, the clerk took our names and led us into a narrow room where the hearing would be held. The complainant had not come sending a lawyer, instead a narrow man with a trimmed beard and polished boots. He read from a paper speaking of debts and property, his voice flat as if he were listing prices. When he finished, the magistrate turned to me. Mr. Harland, do you have anything to say? I stood, the wood floor creaking under my boots. Miriam Harland is my wife. These children are mine in every way that matters. We owe nothing to the people making these claims. The magistrate's gaze shifted to Miriam. She met it without flinching. I left with what was mine and what my children needed to survive, she said. We took nothing from them that wasn't ours already. The magistrate asked a few more questions, then dismissed the lawyer's petition for lack of proof. His gavel struck once, the sound sharp in the small room. The matter was closed. Outside, the air smelled of rain on the plank walk. Cal took my hand as we crossed to the wagon. We won, he asked. We did, I said. The ride home was quieter. Miriam sat close beside me, her shawl pulled tight, one hand resting over her belly. Near the bend where the creek cut under the road, she said, It's the first time I've felt like no one can pull us apart. I kept my eyes on the trail ahead. That's because they can't, I told her. By the time we reached the valley, the clouds had broken and a low light lay across the fields. The young corn shone pale green against the dark soil. Cal jumped down from the wagon before it stopped and ran to check the rows. Annie followed slower, her hands brushing the tops of the plants. That evening after supper, I sat on the porch sharpening a blade while Miriam rocked in the chair beside me. The sound of the strop was steady, the air cooling as the sun slipped behind the ridge. She watched the horizon for a long time before speaking. "I thought I'd always be looking over my shoulder," she said. "Now it feels like I can look ahead." I set the knife aside and reached for her hand. "We've put our stake in this ground," I said. "No one's moving it." She smiled faintly, her eyes still on the distance. Somewhere beyond the ridge, a single rider was making his way down the trail toward the valley, his silhouette just visible against the last light of the day. The rider I'd spotted the evening before came into the yard by mid-morning. His horse was lathered from the trail, and his eyes scanned the place before settling on me. "You Harland?" he asked. I nodded, wiping my hands on a rag. He dismounted slow, reaching into his coat for a folded document. "Judge Waller sent me," he said. "You'll want to read this right off." I took the paper and stepped onto the porch. Miriam came to the door, the light from inside falling across her face. I broke the seal and read in silence. The words were plain enough. Her late husband's kin were appealing the magistrate's ruling, and a full hearing had been set before the circuit judge in 3 weeks' time. They were bringing witnesses this round. Miriam's jaw tightened. "They're not finished with us," she said. I folded the paper. "Then we'll be ready when they come." She turned back into the house without a word, the boards creaking under her step. The next days were filled with work. I rode to the county seat to speak with Judge Waller, who gave what guidance he could without breaking his place in the law. He told me the hearing would be open to the public. "They'll try to shame her before the whole room," he warned. Best be prepared to meet them with proof in hand. So I gathered what proof we had: land receipts in her name, letters from her late husband acknowledging her share, and the deed to our own property. Miriam kept to the house, sewing by lamplight and tending the children, though I could see the strain in her eyes. Cal asked one evening if folks were still trying to take their home. I told him we were holding on to it tighter than ever. One afternoon, a neighbor named Thomas Avery rode over. He was an older man, gray hair under a battered hat, and known to most as steady and fair. He brought with him a small tin box. "Found these while clearing my desk," he said. Inside were ledgers from the mercantile showing Miriam had paid for her supplies herself during those hard years. "Might not seem much," Avery said, "but it shows she stood on her own 2 feet. I thanked him, knowing it was one more piece to lay before the judge. As the hearing drew near, I noticed folks in town talking lower when we walked past. Some offered a nod, others turned away. The ones who'd sided with her husband's kin were likely spreading their own tales. Miriam bore it with a steady face, but I saw her fingers knotting in her shawl when we left the general store. The morning we set out for the county seat, the air was sharp with frost. Miriam wore her best dress, the hem freshly pressed, and a dark cloak over her shoulders. Cal and Annie stayed behind with Mrs. Avery, their faces pressed to the window as we rolled away. The road was long and rutted, the sound of the wheels mixing with the creak of the harness. At the courthouse, the main room was already half full. We took our place at the front, and I laid the papers on the table. Across the aisle sat the lawyer from before, joined this time by 2 men I didn't know, both with the same narrow eyes and thin lips as Miriam's late husband. The judge entered and the room came to its feet. The lawyer spoke first, his words polished and loud enough for the back row. He painted Miriam as someone who'd abandoned her duty and taken what wasn't hers. When he called the 2 men to speak, they told stories meant to cast her in the worst light, leaving out what she'd endured, twisting what little truth they used. When it came my turn, I kept my voice steady. I handed over the deeds, the receipts, and Avery's ledgers. "This woman has built a home from nothing but grit and honest work," I said. "She's raised 2 children without a hand from these men. Every acre she stands on was lawfully earned or freely given." The judge examined each paper, then asked Miriam if she wished to speak. She rose, her hands clasped in front of her. "I've been called many things," she said, "but never a thief until now. I took my children from a place where they had no safety, no kindness, and I gave them both. If that is wrong in the eyes of the law, then I'll bear it. But I'll not bear false witness against myself. The room was quiet when she sat down. Judge Waller cleared his throat and said he would review the evidence and give his ruling the next morning. We stepped out into the chill dusk, the lamps in the street just starting to glow. Miriam's breath clouded in the air. "One more night of waiting," she murmured. I took her hand as we walked toward the inn. Across the square, I caught sight of a figure leaning in the shadows watching us. The figure in the shadows stepped forward the next morning just as we crossed the square toward the courthouse. It was Thomas Avery. He'd stayed in town overnight, saying he wanted to be sure nothing went amiss before the ruling. His presence was a quiet reassurance, and Miriam offered him a small, grateful nod before we entered the building. Inside the room was colder than the day before, though the winter sun poured through the high windows. Judge Waller took his place, the scrape of his chair legs echoing against the walls. He read through the papers again, then laid them down with care. "The claim against Mrs. Carter is without merit," he said, his voice steady. "The deeds stand as they are, and the property remains hers." For a long moment, no one moved. Then I heard the slow exhale from Miriam, the sound of a weight lifting after years of strain. The lawyer for her husband's kin gathered his papers in sharp motions, his clients following him out without a word. Outside, the air felt different, lighter, though the frost still clung to the grass. Miriam stood on the courthouse steps, looking out at the street, as if she needed to see the world with fresh eyes. "It's done," she whispered. I told her it was more than that. It was hers, and no one could take it again. We rode home in the pale afternoon light, the wheels cutting soft grooves in the dirt road. When we reached the house, Cal and Annie came running from the Avery place. Miriam knelt to pull them close, her cloak wrapping around all three. She didn't speak, just held them until their shivers eased. That night, we lit the lamps early. The fire in the hearth threw a warm glow across the walls, and the scent of bread drifted from the kitchen. Miriam moved through the room with an ease I hadn't seen in years, her step light, her eyes no longer shadowed. In the weeks that followed, the talk in town shifted. Those who'd turned away now tipped their hats in passing. Some stopped to speak, though Miriam never sought their approval. Her focus stayed on her home, her children, and the work that kept them all fed and safe. Looking back, I realized the fight had been about more than a deed or a house. It was about a woman's right to stand on her own ground, to keep what she'd earned with her own hands, and to raise her children without fear of it being taken. If you've ever known what it is to guard something precious against those who'd strip it away, you'll understand the quiet strength it takes to hold on. And maybe you'll remember to stand beside someone else when their turn comes.